Early on the morning of the 15th of June, 1955, two workmen arrived at a beach house in the exclusive Florida resort of Manalapan to repair a broken window frame. The house belonged to 58-year-old Eugene Chillingworth, a distinguished state judge. But there was no sign of either him or his wife, Marjorie. The workmen, knowing Chillingworth was a stickler for punctuality, were puzzled. His car was parked in the garage, and through a window they could see the breakfast table was set for two. Assuming that the couple must have stepped out, the workmen decided to go for a swim while they waited. However, as they walked down the steps leading to the beach, they were shocked to see what appeared to be spots of dried blood spattered on the wood. There were also footprints in the sand, and more traces of blood on a pathway going towards the ocean. The blood belonged to the Chillingworths, but they were nowhere to be found. Eugene Chillingworth was born in 1897 and grew up in Palm Beach, Florida. As a young man, he had ambitions to follow in his father's footsteps and joined the legal profession. He graduated at the top of his law class at Florida University, but when the United States entered the First World War in 1917, he decided to join the Navy. He first trained at a U.S. Naval Academy and was then posted to serve on the U.S. cruiser Annapolis. When the war ended in November 1918, he returned to Palm Beach and joined his father's law firm. In 1921, at the age of 24, Chillingworth was appointed a county judge. 2 years later, he was elected to circuit judge, a position he held until his mysterious disappearance in 1955. He had a reputation for being a man of honor and integrity, and was highly regarded by his fellow lawyers. He met his wife, Marjorie McKinley, through family friends. A university graduate, Marjorie was a well-known figure on the Palm Beach social scene. The couple married in 1923 and had 3 daughters. In 1942, Chillingworth, who had remained on the US Navy Reserve List, was recalled to active duty. He was sent to England, where he took part in planning the occupation and recovery of post-war Germany. After the war, he returned to Florida and bought a beachside retreat in Manalapan, where he and his wife spent 10 happy years. On the evening of the 14th of June, 1955, the couple drove to Manalapan from their townhouse in Palm Beach, as they had done on so many weekends. They settled in, had a nightcap, and went to bed. But the next morning, when the two workmen, Frank Ebersold and Robert Force, arrived as arranged, neither the judge nor his wife were anywhere to be seen. At first, the men were merely puzzled. But when they discovered drops of dried blood on the steps to the beach and on a raised path towards the water, they became extremely concerned. They also noticed footprints in the sand leading both to and from the house. The workmen immediately called the police. The area was closed off, and an intensive search for the missing couple began. By nightfall, the blood had been conclusively identified as belonging to the Chillingworths, but there was still no sign of them. The police had no leads. The rumpled state of the beds showed they had been slept in. Every inch of the house and surrounding grounds was searched for clues. Sheriff John Kirk was the officer in charge.
Sheriff, could you tell me approximately how many men are participating in the search for the missing people?
Well, there's probably 100 at tonight.
Does that represent law enforcement officers from what branches?
From all over. They're all here. There's Palm Beach Police, West Palm Beach, Lake Worth, Delray, some Coast Guardmen, and the Sheriff's Department.
3 weeks later, State Attorney Philip O'Connell received a mysterious phone call at his Palm Beach office. "You're the next to go," said an anonymous voice. But nothing happened. With little to go on, the search for the missing judge and his wife was scaled back. It would be 3 years before the investigation got its first major lead. Despite the offer of a substantial reward, no trace had been found of Judge Chillingworth and his wife, who disappeared in June 1955. The case was cold. But 3 years later, in November 1958, the body of a young gangster, Lou Harvey, was discovered in a creek near Palm Beach. The case would lead back to the disappearance of the Chillingworths. Sheriff John Kirk turned to the Florida State Bureau for help. Agent Henry Lovern was assigned to the case. It wasn't long before he discovered that Harvey had been involved in the lucrative and illegal Palm Beach street gambling scene. Harvey had last been seen in the company of Floyd Holsapple, an ambitious local crook who had served time for armed robbery. One of Holsapple's closest associates was Bobby Lincoln. The pair had been running a protection racket and a Florida betting game known as Bolita. Aiding them was Palm Beach Judge Joseph Peel, a former colleague of Judge Chillingworth. Peel was known as the Little Judge to Chillingworth's Big Judge. The two men were very different. Together with his wife Imogen, Peel lived far beyond his means. Living in a large house and driving expensive cars. If Chillingworth had suspected Peel of corruption, he never let on. But he once gave the junior judge a public reprimand for his conduct during a divorce case and opposed advancing Peel's career. Peel had long been attracted by easy money. As a judge signing search warrants, he was in a position to tip off Holsapple and Lincoln when their illegal street gambling rings were about to be raided. If any of the men were ever arrested, Peel could help them. For this help, he was making as much as $3,000 a week. Agent Lovern thought Holsapple was probably involved in the death of Lou Harvey, a police informant. During the course of his investigation, Lovern spoke to Jim Yenzer, an insurance salesman, who'd had some criminal dealings in the past with Holsapple. Anxious not to be implicated in a murder case, Yenzer suddenly announced that Holsapple knew something about the disappearance of Judge Chillingworth and his wife. He also told the astonished agent that Judge Peel was involved. Yenzer then offered to go undercover, renew his acquaintanceship with Holsapple, and gain his confidence by taking part in some criminal activity. Lovern readily agreed, hoping that this might lead him to Peel. A few weeks later, Yenzer tipped off the police that Holsapple was planning to hijack a truckload of weapons intended for rebels in Nicaragua. Police moved in and foiled the attempt, seizing a large quantity of rifles and machine guns. Holsapple, taken completely by surprise, was arrested. Meanwhile, during the ensuing confusion, Yenzer slipped away without arousing the suspicion of the rest of the criminal gang. Holsapple was soon out on bail. He knew he'd been set up. In February 1959, he was charged with the attempted gun heist. It was an open and shut case, and there was little which could be said in his defense. He was found guilty and sentenced to 15 years. However, pending an appeal, Holsapple was once again released on bail. But this time, he absconded and fled to Rio de Janeiro, where he intended to lie low for a few months. Worried that Holsapple might reveal his own criminal activities, Judge Peel encouraged him to stay away from the US for as long as possible. But Holsapple grew resentful that Peel was taking more than his fair share of the proceeds from an investment company they'd set up. Peel then contacted Yenza and told him to get rid of Holsapple. Yenza then told the police. In September 1960, Holsapple returned to Florida, confident he could wriggle out of his conviction. He met Yenza in a motel and, over 3 drunken days, told him that he and Peel had been involved in the disappearance of the Chillingworths. Police had wired his room and heard every word. On the 3rd of October, Holsapple was arrested. Alone in his cell that night, he attempted suicide by slashing his wrists. He was discovered half an hour later and rushed to the hospital. State Attorney O'Connell then announced that Judge Peel and another associate were in police custody.
With the assistance of the Sheriff's Office in Brevard County, Joseph Peel and Don Miles were arrested and charged with conspiracy to murder.
There has been quite a bit of speculation in the local press as to a connection between this and the Judge Chillingworth case. What could you say about that?
I have absolutely no comment to make on that, because our investigation continues at all times, and I feel it would be wrong to even deny or admit or even speculate that anything at this time has reference to any other case.
But Peel didn't remain in custody long. He put up $25,000 bail and promptly disappeared. Meanwhile, Peel's former partner, Bobby Lincoln, was doing time for selling illegal alcohol. Realizing that Holsapple would implicate him in the Chillingworth case, Lincoln agreed to give evidence in return for immunity. He then confessed that Peel had hired him and Holsapple to kill Chillingworth, because he knew the senior judge wanted him disbarred for misconduct. Peel was eventually found hiding out in Tennessee. It looked as if the mystery of the missing Chillingworths would be solved at last. On the 7th of March 1961, Judge Joseph Peel went on trial, charged with the murders of Judge Eugene Chillingworth and his wife Marjorie in June 1955. The case made national news. State Attorney Philip O'Connell, assisted by Eugene Spellman, led the prosecution. The difficult task of defending Peel fell to Carlton Welch. Meanwhile, Holsapple, who had been in police custody for 5 months, confessed that he was guilty of the murders of Judge Chillingworth and his wife. Arriving in court, Holsapple didn't hesitate in implicating Peel in the various criminal rackets he'd been running in Palm Beach with Bobby Lincoln. Holsapple testified that when Peel heard that Chillingworth wanted him disbarred, he said they had to get rid of him, otherwise they were all finished. It was then that Holsapple had enlisted the help of Bobby Lincoln. They bought a small boat, loaded it with rope, 2 army surplus belts, and several lead weights. The idea had been to kidnap Chillingworth, kill him, and dump his body far out in the ocean. On the evening of the 14th of June, 1955, Holsapple and Lincoln set off from the Riviera Beach dock and made their way along the coast to Chillingworth's beach house. They arrived shortly after midnight and moored just offshore while they kept a close eye on the house. Peel had told them that no one would be home except Judge Chillingworth. But when they came in, they discovered that the judge was not alone. His wife, Marjorie, was also there. Together with her husband, Marjorie had been trussed and gagged and forced outside at gunpoint. While they were on the steps leading to the beach, Marjorie had managed to work her gag loose and scream. That's when Holsapple cracked his gun on her head. The court then heard from Lincoln that the terrified couple had been forced into the boat. Chillingworth, who'd realized what was about to happen, tried desperately to reason with the two men. But 2 miles offshore, they tied a weighted belt round Marjorie's waist and pushed her overboard. The judge then managed to throw himself over the side and tried to swim away. But the killers pulled him back to the boat, wrapped the anchor chain round his neck, and watched as he sank into the depth. Holsapple, who frequently broke down in court, said he'd been forced into the heinous crime by Peel, who wanted to get rid of Chillingworth at any price. Lincoln corroborated Holsapple's story. Lincoln told the hushed court that Chillingworth's last words to his wife were, "Remember that I love you." No matter how hard Peel's defense lawyer tried to refute Lincoln's testimony, the jury seemed convinced he was telling the truth. Peel was further damned when Yenzer, the police informant, told the court that Peel had wanted him to kill Holsapple. There was a commotion when the jury heard that Peel had even tried to have Holsapple poisoned while he was on remand in prison. Prosecutor O'Connell produced the evidence.
We'd like to say that now we have uncovered the poisoning effort. We have found that a sufficient cyanide was on a cigarette package which was delivered to a trustee in the jail with the express purpose of having it sent up to Floyd Holsapple.
Peel was arrogant enough to make himself the main witness for his defense. His wife Imogen, utterly convinced of her husband's innocence, attended court every day. Peel continued to deny any involvement with either Holsapple or Lincoln, saying he hadn't hired them to murder Judge Chillingworth and his wife. Both he and his defense lawyer worked hard to persuade the jury to acquit him. First, they argued there were no bodies, and second, Peel was on trial for his life solely because of the evidence given by two convicted criminals. Despite his eloquent charm, Peel sensed that the mood of the court and the public who crowded in every day was against him. After 17 days, the jury retired to consider their verdict in a case which had gripped the nation. They were back in just 2 hours. Peel was guilty. To the outrage of the prosecution, who had demanded the death penalty, Peel was sentenced to life imprisonment. It was revealed later that the jury had been split 50-50 over execution. As Peel was taken away, his defense lawyer, Carlton Welch, said that everyone was entitled to trial by jury, not by press or public opinion. Peel continued to protest his innocence. A reporter asked him if there were any extenuating circumstances which might clear him.
Yes, there are. One very interesting matter is that we know now that on a retrial we can show positively that Bobby Lincoln was not aboard the boat that night as he testified, and as Holsapple has testified, and we can show that he was on land and directed that boat to shore.
Lincoln, however, who was released from jail in 1962, never wavered from his testimony. But Peel wouldn't give up.
On the day that the jury retired in my case for their verdict, Mrs. Griggs's attorney approached Mr. Welsh and myself and Mr. Rogers and informed us that he had a client who had averred to him that she had in fact seen Judge Chillingworth during the month of September of 1955.
On the 3rd of May, 1961, Floyd Holsapple was sentenced to death for the murder of the Chillingworths. Everyone was shocked. Holsapple had implicated Peel and willingly confessed his crime, thus sparing the state the expense of a trial. He immediately appealed, and the sentence was eventually commuted to life instead. At the time of his death in 1996, a prison officer said that by bringing Judge Peel to justice, Holsapple had at last done something decent with his life. Peel was finally released in 1982, aged 58, suffering from terminal cancer. He died a few days later without admitting his guilt. And to this day, no trace of the Chillingworth has ever been found.
Next tonight, a history premiere goes in search of Japan's lost samurai subs.